June last year, my wife and I were in Manhattan, and there was this completely unpredictable moment for myself in a dimly lit theater when the world premiere of the Poisoned documentary, Poisoned, The Dirty Truth About Your Food, took place during the Tribeca Film Festival. Now, I should point out that earlier that day, we had visited the 9/11 Memorial while we were in town. And so here I was sitting watching the documentary. It wasn't the first time I'd seen it. I'd seen it twice at home in its earlier draft versions. I had been involved behind the scenes and in front of the camera. But sitting in this theater, a live presentation of this documentary, and the majority of the people in the audience just literally bought a ticket. They didn't even know what they were going to go see. But I was overwhelmed with this sense of this immortalization of my son's story. Back in 1993, during the rather landmark Jack in the Box E. coli outbreak, my son got sick. I had just left operating a nuclear reactor and being a quality assurance inspector on a submarine, and went to pick up my son at his daycare center, and there was a note on the door that another child had tested positive for E. coli and to look for these symptoms. We saw these symptoms immediately. I described this in the documentary. These images in my mind of holding him on my lap on a hospital bed, and he was in some stage of renal failure at this point, and he looked at an IV bag hanging on a pole, and he called for Baba because it was full of liquid. It had marks, kind of like a bottle. And to him, that, one of his words he had, it made sense, but I came to realize later that it wasn't just a call for normalcy, it was a call for comfort, it was a call for trying to make sense out of what was going on. I'll never forget seeing him being put onto a helicopter to be airlifted about an hour and a half away to Children's Hospital in Seattle. Little tuft of his blonde hair peeking out from underneath blankets and straps. And I actually couldn't be there to see this with my own eyes. I'm watching this on television because it's being covered live by the local news station. I'll never forget seeing him after he came out of exploratory surgery when he was in a medically induced coma after he had the majority of his intestines removed because of hemolytic uremic syndrome. Now, mind you, most people are learning about this word E. coli for the first time, including myself. And this is not the kind of conversation around food safety that we should be having in terms of consumers focusing on food safety after going through these harmful events. The last memory that I'll never forget, the last image, is seeing him again outside the hospital being carried in the world's smallest coffin. Telling the story and showing images and videos from 1993 in this documentary, in a sense, was almost ironic because I was working in 1993, 1994 with television executives. They wanted to make a television movie about this event. But they ultimately canceled the project, saying that there wasn't enough sex and violence to sell this to the American mainstream media market, and that the American public could not palate a conversation about food safety and about failures and dangers in our food. And yet, if you look at these numbers, and I'm sure we've heard these numbers, 48 million Americans get sick, 128,000 are hospitalized, and some 3,000 die every year due to mostly preventable failures in food safety. Those numbers are one of the constants over the last 31 years. I have never seen these numbers change, not even by 1%. 3,000 times 30 years, that's over 90,000 families since my son's death that live with a chair forever empty at their family table. This documentary, to me, became a bigger-than-life opportunity, if you will. Not just kind of immortalizing my son's story, but if you realize, the 9/11 Memorial is this opportunity to reflect on the lives of some 3,000 souls that perished on 9/11. Some 3,000 Americans die every year due to failures in food safety. There's no statue, there's no monument, there's no memorial. To me, this documentary is the closest thing that we have to something that the mainstream audience can look at and say that here's a way to reflect on this situation, to reflect on these victims and these families' lives because of this almost ceasingly endless cycle of failure and reform. The emotions I was feeling that day were just, 30 years building up with my work to see something that is being seen by people who normally don't see what goes on behind the scenes. Most of the work that everyone does in this room, I'm sure that other people can understand what you do, but most people don't see what you do. Most people don't see what we do. They don't see what we're trying to prevent, what we're trying to protect, what we're trying to put back in the bottle, if you will, put that genie back in the bottle. It's as if there's an assumption that someone does this work. There's an assumption that our food is safe. But we see things in the news. We see in the news over and over again constant examples of where someone is getting it wrong. And yes, it's the squeaky wheel. For every example of a company that fails in terms of food safety, there's countless numbers of companies, of people, of experts that are putting their day in, day out effort into making sure that food is as safe as possible. But we're still dealing with these crazy numbers, these crazy examples. Just when we think you've heard it all or seen it all, something else comes along that's like, okay, how did we get to this point where now this is the problem or this is the food? So last week, I had another one of these kind of cathartic experiences that kind of changed my perspective of things. I get a message from a woman in England who starts telling me about her son who recovered and survived from E. coli and hemolytic uremic syndrome a number of years ago, and that she had just come across and watched the documentary Poisoned. And she wanted to stress two things to me. One is that this was the first time that she was able to have something that's tangible, that she can refer her family and her friends to show what kind of a harrowing experience she and her family went through with her son's illness. That you can talk about things, but to see what that hospital room looks like, to see what children go through, to see the toll, not only on the victim, but on their family, it's not something that we normally were able to find out there until this documentary. She also shared that her son's at an age now where he can actually kind of understand and now appreciate this documentary as a kind of, don't take my word, don't take mom's word for it, right? Watch this, because this is what you went through. And it really highlighted for me the fact that I saw my responsibility as being much more than just the idea of immortalizing my son's story. Again, every year, some 3,000 families bury a loved one because of failures. Tens and hundreds of thousands of people deal with these illnesses, but their voices aren't necessarily heard. So I felt an immense responsibility to share my voice as an opportunity to essentially share the voices of so many people that don't get the opportunity to share their voice, their perspective about this. Last year, I also got a message. There's a family in New Orleans, their 2-year-old daughter, who is recovering right now, going through E. coli, HUS, dealing with dialysis, was expected to not survive. Thankfully, she is recovering. But she sent me a text message with a photo of her daughter in that hospital room, the pediatric intensive care unit at the Children's Hospital in New Orleans. And it's as if there was no difference between that photo and a photo from 30 years earlier of my son. It looks exactly the same. A young child under 2 years of age, a body completely dwarfed by wires and tubes and monitors and equipment that fill up a room, that have numbers and lights and sounds, and these numbers, you hear information from a doctor and you're hearing them say that you want these numbers to go up or these numbers to go down, and as a parent, you have nothing else you can do other than sitting there, and you can't hold your child, you can't touch your child because of just the amount of tubes and wires connected to them, and you're left with doing nothing other than watching these numbers and hoping that there's a change in a positive direction. You don't even know what these machines do, quite honestly, but you're hoping that there's some positive change. I got another message from someone in the same kind of situation, and she goes, "Good God, it's 2023. This is the United States of America. How can this be happening?" And for me, it hit me really hard, because in 1993, I was quoted in a newspaper saying, "It's 1993. This is the United States of America. How can this be happening?" So there's a ripple effect in terms of change and consistency that we deal with when it comes to food safety. Over time, some things have changed. We just saw a week ago the largest federal fine related to food safety failure with Family Dollar Store in their central distribution center. I see some heads nodding, in Arkansas. Raise your hand if you recall that incident. Thousands of live and dead rodents, and repeated reports done by state environmental health experts saying that we're finding this evidence, we're finding these facts, we're finding this rodent activity, we're finding excrement, we're finding signs of packages that have been nibbled into, and literally the company signed off on it 8 times. The state health environmental people finally being able to convince the FDA that they need to look into this. They took one look at it. They said, "You need to shut it down." Everything regulated by the FDA, pharmaceutical, biomedical, animal food, human food, cosmetics, that went through that distribution center between January of 2021 and February of 2022 was recalled. This impacted over 400 stores across 6 states. And yet executives knew about it and signed off on this over and over and over again. And now they're just paying a 41 point something, basically $42 million fee, the largest we've ever seen. Previously, Chipotle paid $25 million for their series of outbreaks. We probably can't get that out of our mind. Numerous outbreaks, multiple states, multiple pathogens. Blue Bell Creameries, like a month later, after the announcement for Chipotle's large fee, paid $17.9 million, the second largest. Right? So what we can see is that the fines and fees from the government, by the way, most of these are them paying a large amount of money so they won't prosecute anyone. Those have gone up. What else has gone up is the number of states impacted, the number of people impacted, the number of products recalled, the amount of work that's created that environmental health specialists are out there trying to figure out what is the source of this, how do we track this down, how do we solve this? We just recently learned about the issue with lead in applesauce. And we saw another cantaloupe incident. And this one took 14 lives between the US and Canada. 14 or 15 lives. And what's crazy is, during this period of time in January, there were 3 outbreaks of note. There was another outbreak with sprouts. There was another outbreak with cantaloupe. And there was another outbreak with packaged leafy greens. All 3 of which, when I was asked, and this was part near the end of the documentary, what are the 3 things I avoid? Most people assume I avoid red meat. I did avoid red meat for about 20 years after my son's death. But there comes a point when you realize it's kind of hypocritical of me if I realize that if I was to avoid everything that was ever a culprit in food safety failures, well, there'd be nothing left. But what do I avoid? Number 1, cantaloupe. And this is what's crazy. I already said what I'm saying to avoid, so I can't say guess which food, but of all the outbreaks, and we think about meat and poultry a great deal, but now we think about produce. Cantaloupe is the most deadly. 33 people died from one outbreak of cantaloupe about 15 years ago, and here another 15 or so die from a significant outbreak with cantaloupe. I talk about sprouts. Sprouts has had outbreaks like every other year. And I'm going to come back to sprouts in a minute. And then leafy greens. We keep seeing these problems with leafy greens. Now, leafy greens, how many people, show of hands, how many people have heard of greenhouse grown or indoor farming or controlled environment agriculture? This is an incredible change that we are seeing. So much more of leafy green growing operation is now starting to take place in these controlled environmental agriculture environments, these places where they're eliminating the same kind of consistent problems they're dealing with the water for irrigation and with the pests and animals coming through and the exposure to the lettuce and the leafy greens. This is great. I've been very fortunate to tour some of these facilities and to see what work goes into what they're doing. But the most incredible piece of innovation came about, I kid you not, a company in Northern California reaches out to me and says, "Hey, Darren, so you mentioned sprouts in the documentary. We'd like you to come visit our plant and see how we have innovated sprouts completely differently." Anyone know how sprouts are made? You can all put your hands down. It's like a front-load washing machine. These barrels, these tumble around. They basically plant the seeds, and they continuously water it at 70 degrees to get this to grow as fast and as fat as they can, right? And this water contaminates everything. And this water is obviously problematic because it's a great temperature for growth of pathogens. So this company decides, hey, let's completely change the game. They figured out a way to grow the seeds, to germinate them and grow them. They actually package them in the kind of clamshell plastic container that you buy them in. They grow from seeds in that container. But here's the thing, the entire operation takes place below 40 degrees. From seed to fully a grown product. And it still actually is continuing to grow. It's a live product that goes out of the stores. Completely changed the way that it's grown. It's a true innovation that's driven by one factor: food safety. At a time when most major retailers had taken sprouts out of their stores around 2012 because of continuous failures, their product was the only one to get back into stores. To me, this is an incredible example of if you have the will, you can deal with innovation and make policy decisions, make economic decisions, make operational decisions that will actually be safer than the status quo. And guess what? Their product is growing to the point where they're doubling their production facilities and they're expanding their markets because people love their product. In fact, their product is better than it was in terms of like protein and other factors. I'm not a salesman. I should know these things better. My wife and I went to their facility. We walked around. We got to see all this stuff. But it was one of those times where I was trying to find, do I have another example of when I was invited to see this working and truly see innovation? I'm impressed enough that here I am talking about it on stage with all of you. The point being is that there has been change. There has been change. Change in the agricultural or indoor agriculture or how they're even growing sprouts. Change can happen. There's a lot of other changes. Right? It used to be that when we talk about food safety, it was food regulated by the USDA. Are there still problems with foods regulated by the USDA? Yes. But the majority of failures that we see, the majority of the activity is the food regulated by the FDA. It's the everything else, all of 80% of all kind of foods. We have such an incredible growth in ready-to-eat and consumer packaged goods. We have ingredients that are coming from farther. We have more ingredients. We have more steps involved. And we have more of a growth in terms of the idea of relying on these commercially packaged goods, these ready-to-eat foods. I'm not saying that's bad. Some people are pointing out some controversial elements of it, like when, I don't know, a CEO of Kellogg said, hey, I know that fresh food is becoming too expensive, and that families that can't afford to eat fresh food should just eat cereal for dinner. That's an interesting take on it. But the reality is that we are relying not only more on consumer commercially packaged goods and ready-to-eat foods, but even the way we get foods. It's not just the brick and mortar restaurant and retail. We have hybrids. We have grocery stores that have restaurants inside of them. We have restaurants that have grocery stores inside of them. We also have people that are eating foods from food cart or that's delivered to them partially prepared, and they have to finish cooking it at home from a box that's left on their doorstep for who knows how long. We have people that are using apps to have a grocery store do the shopping for them, or apps to have a third or fourth party now removed person go to a grocery store and do the shopping for them. And I've had conversations with some of these people, and here's what's crazy. They say, I don't understand the difference between free range and caged free and all these different terminologies, just on like a package of chicken, for instance. There's all these different things. And it's like, how do you know what you're going to get if these people don't even know what these terms mean? Because quite honestly, do any of us really know what all those terms mean on packages of food? Maybe some of us do. But it's crazy how specific they can be. And not only do we have third or fourth party shopping, but we then have fourth or fifth party delivery of the food sometimes from a store. So we become even that much more removed from the source, from the decision making, from that locus of control of our food. In 2012, the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics noted that the first time they were ever recording this information, Americans were now spending more of their food money on food that's prepared outside of the house than on food that they're going to take back into the house and prepare for themselves. So this becomes an interesting opportunity to look at the idea that it's not just the kinds of foods that are changing, it's the consumer behavior in terms of how they are getting food and what stage of food's development, if you will, or preparedness are they getting these foods. I was explaining to someone recently that lasagna is one of those interesting kind of examples. You can buy the ingredients to make your sauce from scratch, your pasta from scratch, right? You can buy the pre-made pasta and the pre-made sauces and make lasagna at home. You can buy a frozen lasagna, like a Stouffer's, right? You can go, how many people you see at your grocery store, you have the counter where it's cooked and ready to go, and you can buy that cooked, and it's either cold and you got to heat it up, or it's hot and you can eat it right now over there in the seating area, right? Or you can go to the restaurant down the French Quarter here and you can eat lasagna at your table that they bring to you that's already cooked. And I know there's some people that go like, so what? Isn't it all the same? No, think about completely different phases of development for this kind of food. And if we kind of accept this normalized version of, well, this is what lasagna is, I'll tell you this. I know I'm going to get some hands out of this. Like, I'm a sucker for potato salad and for macaroni and cheese. Raise your hand when you went to grandma's house, she made macaroni and cheese or potato salad or whatever it is better than anything you can buy on the store. Raise your hand. Let's give grandma a round of applause. All right? Imagine a generation that doesn't have that experience. To them, it's always out of a plastic container. It's always frozen. It's always this. And we always have this assumption that, okay, yeah, it's just as safe as if we make it from scratch. Let alone the fact that it has 175 ingredients listed on the package, and that those 175 ingredients can come from 105 countries and can have traveled farther than you'll ever travel in your life. And that if any one stage of that product's development, if there was any one failure, that could be an error carried forward that could impact you in terms of food safety or allergen or some other kind of a situation. Lead in applesauce, right? These are real problems. So what has changed can be seen as there's a lot of problems today. It's a greatly diverse and complicated environment. Let me put a positive spin on it. Today, one of the coolest things I've seen that's different than I saw 31 years ago is that 31 years ago, I was considered an outsider. I was literally called names, and people were trying to get me to stop talking because I was informing people about things. I brought an all too emotional context to this concept that we're waking up to about the idea of failures in food safety. And yet, some of these same companies that called me the crying mom that wore pants or the dirty Harry of the meat industry, they call me up and say, hey, we want you to speak at this corporate event. How much would it cost? What would it take for you to come speak at this event because we value your opinion? Consumers today, unlike 3 decades ago, are considered to be stakeholders in the food industry. 31 years ago, we just bought the food, right? It's like we didn't have an opinion. If we didn't own stock in the company, we didn't matter. And raise your hand if you saw the documentary Poisoned. All right, good. I see some hands. One of the things that I'm always addressing questions about is the scene where the little chicks are coming down the conveyor belt. A, oh my God, I had no idea that's where chicken came from. But B, why did they include this scene with chicks coming down a conveyor belt and just dropping off into a bin? To which my response is, perhaps that's a very poetic way of showing that in the past, consumers were considered to be very much akin to those chicks going down that conveyor belt, dropping off the edge. And you know what? There'll be another one coming down the conveyor belt, and another one, and another one. We don't have to worry about consumers. But today, consumers are considered to be stakeholders. Consumers have more and more voice. And I believe social media has a great role in this. We are asking questions. We're searching for information. We want definitions. We want history. We want to look at other examples. We want to see how we can avoid this, what causes this. We want to look at ratings of restaurants. We want to look up information about food manufacturers. We want to look up this information. We want to find this information out. But if you think of like a funnel, it's not just those people at the top of the funnel who are looking for information. You have some people that become a little bit more involved. They're subscribing, they're becoming members, they're becoming loyal to people that have certain voices about food safety. There are people that connect with me on LinkedIn just to hear what I have to say about things. It's kind of cool. I have hundreds and I have tens of I have hundreds of thousands. You're my number one. Connections on LinkedIn. And but it goes further, because there are even some people that are more active. They're putting information out. They're generating information. There's crowdsourcing of information. There's a website out there called I Was Poisoned. You hear of that? It's kind of like Yelp reviews, but for foodborne illness. There's at least a hand in the back there. There are entire outbreaks, illnesses and outbreaks that were never communicated to the county or state health department, but were identified through people analyzing data through crowdsourcing and validating information. And a recent, well, not too recent, I guess 10 years old, but a 2014 study from Columbia University found that in New York, Yelp reviews alone identified 16 valid cases that were able to go back and researchers validated it, but 3 completely unknown outbreaks, all from crowdsourced information. That's impressive. There's research out there that's finding that norovirus, communication around norovirus is faster through crowdsourcing than it is through state and county health officials. It's just how the speed of different things. But it goes more than that. We see social media influencers. We saw this, for instance, how many people remember the Daily Harvest? The crumbles, right? All these people were like, hi, I'm a social media influencer. You need to buy this product. It's the best thing ever. And then those same people were like, hi, so I'm in the hospital. I just had my kidney removed. And I'm hoping I'm going to live through this. And hold on. I'm very weak, but I'm strong enough to tell you, avoid this product. If you have this, get rid of this product. Do not buy this product. If you work for this company, you need to step up. And this was a very powerful and influential way of communicating this information. It works both ways. Social media influencers can be the greatest contributor to a new startup, a new company, a new brand, a new product. They can also be a voice that is the voice of caution, the voice of awareness, the voice of, hey, we need to ask questions. Why is this ingredient in there? Why are they continuing to sell this? We're seeing the role of social media and consumers as stakeholders more and more. And sometimes it has nothing to do with food safety, right? You have people saying, you shouldn't go to this company because they don't allow women to breastfeed in their restaurants. Or you shouldn't buy from this company because they contribute to this political figure or to this anti-this or pro-this, right? Because the CEO made this racist statement, because the CEO got on some morning show and said things like, you know, if you're poor, eat cereal for dinner. So, hey, let's have a boycott of Kellogg's starting April 1st. And I'm not trying to make a statement, but that is what it is. How many people are aware of this movement now to boycott Kellogg's? How many people saw the boxes of Kellogg's cereal over there on the counter and went, dot, connection? Right? Social media influencers are a great example of how consumers are asking this question. Why is it that I saw in the newspaper that restaurant has over 240 critical food safety failures, and yet they're still open? I assume that if you have all these failures in food safety, that there'd be a lock on the door. But I was able to go there and continue to shop there. Why is this? People ask these questions. What is the role of health inspectors? I got a media call recently from the New York Times. They're looking into the world of the environmental health inspector. And I connected her with some folks. But here are some of the things we were talking about. What was the climate that created a situation where the woman in Los Angeles took her own life because of the stress she was under at work? Why is it that there's retaliation in Lewiston, Maine against an inspector who closed a restaurant? Why is it that we're still dealing with the ramifications of the shooting in, not Riverside, but San Bernardino County, California, of their environmental health inspectors? Why is it that we're dealing with these stresses? And I was trying to point out some other things. I go around and talk to many states' environmental health organizations. And one of the most consistent themes that I hear is a worry about the fact that the state is not paying enough in terms of the resources, but also to attract new employees and to keep them around for more than 3 years. And in fact, a good majority of the people that work in these different state agencies have retired and come back to work because that's the only way they can afford to do their work and have an honest, be able to afford the cost of living. This is crazy. During the pandemic, there were people that are like, oh, people who work in the food industry, they're essential workers, as if they weren't essential workers before, right? And people go, oh, firemen, police officer, doctors. Yeah, let's look at the role of environmental health inspectors in terms of true first responders when it comes to so many of the issues that we're dealing with. Because, yeah, those medical officials, those medical responders, they're not even going to get involved until, in most cases, environmental health inspectors, environmental health agencies got involved and did their work and put two and two together and were able to give this information to the medical community and beyond. And we don't see that recognition at the state or federal level. So there's so many things we have to look at in terms of not only the changing environment for consumers, but the changing environment that we here are working in, that in some cases are working for us, and in many cases start to be working against us. I do believe that consumers are becoming more and more aware of food safety, but there's still gaps. And one of the gaps is, we hear this all the time, raise your hand if it irks you when someone says, oh, I must have a stomach bug or stomach flu. It's a good excuse for me to stay home from work. And you realize that what they're really talking about is some kind of a foodborne virus, some kind of a pathogen, right? And that while the healthy adult may see it as a nuisance, it is the most vulnerable victims, the most vulnerable populations, the very young, those who are pregnant, those with a compromised immune system, and the elderly, who are the most likely to end up in those numbers of being hospitalized and dying. And more, these populations are the least likely to be making those choices in terms of what they're getting, how they're getting, and what food they're making, or what food they're getting, where they're getting it from, how they're getting it. And yet, during the pandemic, we saw an increase in these multi-generational families living together, and people not aware of the fact that, hey, maybe you shouldn't feed this food to your grandparents, or maybe you shouldn't feed this food to your toddler. So it's becoming more and more complicated in that sense. I also worry that too many times people hear foodborne illness, food safety, failure, whatever, and they think it's all about eating it. The reality is that my son never ate the hamburger that killed him. My son got sick from person-to-person contact with another child in his daycare class. That child's mother was assistant manager at the Jack in the Box in town, the only Jack in the Box in town. And she cooked a hamburger to a temperature that was required by the company, but that was actually far below that mandated by the state as a minimum cooking temperature for hamburgers at fast food restaurants. She immediately saw symptoms in herself and her child. She took herself and her child to go get tested, but back in 1993, it took 48 hours for test results to come back. When test results did come back, the health department was notified immediately, which in and of itself is a miracle because in many states that actually would not happen. But the health department was notified that they had a mother and daughter who tested positive for E. coli. A representative went out to their home to find that there was no one home. Called a number that was on some paperwork, found out that the mom went back to Jack in the Box with E. coli, sick with E. coli, to flip hamburgers. And what did she do with her child? Put him in daycare. Heard that. She did not tell them, and all of a sudden he has bloody diarrhea. They don't know what to do about this. The investigators found that the daycare had done an incredible job of sanitation and cleaning, and if they had not done it, it would have been far more victims than just my son. I can't blame an 18-month-old, and in this case, I can't blame the daycare center. And there's an extent to which I can't even blame the mom. I mean, here was a 22-year-old woman who, she couldn't take a sick day off because the company's sick leave policy was non-existent, and she didn't have sick days. B, she was following the corporate policy. The corporation decided that it was okay to violate state law. They admitted that they violated state law. And here's what gets crazy. No state or federal charges were filed against this company that was responsible for the death of 4 children in the act of breaking the law. Now, I mentioned earlier in my presentation about all these major fines and fees that companies are paying. Imagine what message would have been sent if 30 years ago there were state or federal charges, there were fines against this company. Imagine the ripple effect that could have come from that if that took place then. The fact that I have, as a professor, I as someone for 31 years who's been looking at this, I as someone who's been in courtrooms where there have been some trials, raise a hand, show of hands. How many people know if anyone's ever gone to prison because of a failure in food safety? I see some hands. And there's a reason why there's some doubt in here. I can only name 8 people who've gone to prison. 8 people. And none of them went to prison because of charges about making anyone sick or killing them. It was all about obstruction of justice, tax fraud, evasion, entering contaminated or adulterated foods into market. And up until about 2015, the most significant sentence was 3 months. 3 months for the father and son owners of an egg company out of Ohio. But then we had the Peanut Corporation of America, and the CEO, I was in the courtroom, his attorney said, "Your Honor, we know you have to send my client to prison for a few months, but we want to have some witnesses to show how he's practically Mother Teresa in pants. Look, he's got a fleet of airplanes. He flies people for angel flights, for surgeries. He's got all these boats. There's all these people around the world that love and adore him." And sentencing came down, and the shock in the courtroom when he was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. Almost, I think it was 96 federal felony charges he was found guilty of, and most of it had to do with obstruction of justice, all these different things, but not a single one was actually related to, technically, by the word of it, harming someone, making someone sick, or killing anyone. And yet 9 people died. His attorney then said, "We hope that you'll allow him to be in, what do they call that? Remanded to home custody until such time he has to report to the prison system." And the judge said, "No, U.S. Marshals, take him now." His own witnesses basically described him as a flight risk. He's got all these boats, all these planes, all these contracts around the world. Why would we not believe that he would use these now? The shock in that room, though. You went from 3 months to 28 years. That was a shock felt far beyond the courtroom. It was felt in boardrooms across the food industry, and quite honestly, beyond the food industry. The idea that someone could be held strictly and personally liable for their failures, their direct, almost malicious attempt. He literally said, "I know it's contaminated, just ship it," in an email. about the product. They were lying. They were changing the results of tests. His quality assurance manager was labeled the queen of liquid paper because if she didn't have reports that were good, she just put liquid paper and changed the dates on ones that were good and then shipped those off to their companies they supplied the product to. So there are failures out there that are catastrophic. There are failures that end up being landmark examples. But the reality is the court system, the legal system, the investigation, all that kind of stuff, it takes years and years to be able to find that stuff out. When someone is sick or someone has a child who is sick, immediately, here's what's crazy. They say, we want someone from the FDA to help us. And they call the FDA, and the FDA says, well, we don't know if it's because of a food that's under our regulatory authority. Call the USDA. They call the USDA, and guess what? They get the same exact response. Once we find out, if we're able to find out, some 80% of people, if they are tested positive for a foodborne pathogen, that's one thing, but they will never actually know what caused them to be sick. If it's connected to, and that may take a long time, then the USDA or the FDA may step in and provide some support. So it comes down to our state and county level officials who are able to be much more connected to the public health concerns around them. So there's a lot of different concerns and things that are changing. Let's talk about media. Media has changed radically. In the last 30 years, so many newspapers have been closed or consolidated, or now they're only online. You hear a great deal of talk in the political sphere about bias, right? Liberal, conservative. I talk with media people, and one of the first questions I ask are, what is your normal beat? What is your desk? Right? A, I would say the average age of a reporter I talk to is 21, 22. B, they could work for the local desk, the national desk, the crime desk, the food desk. I've talked to people from the sports desk before. I don't know why. Arts and entertainment. I'm not kidding. Remember the one about festivals and about roadkill? It's like, okay, but A, at least you want to talk about food safety, right? And these conversations I have, for the most part, it becomes oh, this isn't the first time we've ever had an outbreak like this. Let me tell you about the history. Or, oh, this isn't an FDA thing. Let me tell you about this. Or, oh, there's laws about this. There's a precedence here. There's some background to this. And I have to give them kind of like a food safety 101 for 45 minutes because I feel, look, if they're going to talk about this, let's at least get it right. Right? The idea of people getting sick from listeria and a journalist not realizing that there are some pathogens that it could be days, weeks, even months after you ate something that got you this sick. So it's not necessarily the last thing that you ate. So there's a lot of problem with that. Change and continuity, when you look at it over decades, is an opportunity to become very negative. And believe me, if there aren't great examples of bright moments out there, of incredible people, incredible companies, incredible stories out there, I don't know what kind of a very shriveled, angry person I would be. But when we look at change over the last 3 decades in terms of companies and individuals that look at the idea of a food safety legacy, this is one of the things that truly inspires me. This afternoon, from like 1:30 to 3 or something like that, I'm going to be doing a workshop in one of the salons where I'm talking about how to communicate and how to really kind of grab onto some of this. But I want to hit a couple highlights right now. One of the things that we have to hold on to is this idea of, well, let me put it this way. Raise your hand if you currently or soon will or have in the past had teenagers in your house. All right, now, 4 words. You want your kid to clean the room or to take out the trash or to clean the kitchen or something. Wash their hands, who knows? And they say, why? What are the 4 worst words a parent can say to their teenager to motivate them to do that? What? Because I told you so. Or some variation of that, right? Not once have I ever heard of a story where a teenager goes, oh, okay, thank you. Now I understand. Makes all the sense in the world. Say no more, Mom. I'm going to do it right now. Here's what's crazy. When you go out to restaurants, when you go out to grocery stores, when you go out to any kind of food facility, and you've got that newest employee on the floor, this is exactly how supervisors talk to them. You need to wash your hands after you use the bathroom before you come back in the kitchen. Why? Because I told you to. You need to wash your hands after you sweep the floor and take out the trash. You need to put on gloves. You need to wash your hands before you put on a new pair of gloves. You can't wear that pair of gloves that has holes in them. You can't be on your phone while you're stirring the pot. You can't be drinking out of a cup that's unlidded. You can't be using a cup to scoop ice out of the container. Why? Because I told you to. That's the kind of communication that goes on now. So what we have is kind of like the carrot or the stick, right? This idea of younger employees, junior employees who are doing things because they're told to, because of fear of being fired or not getting the hours they want to work or whatever, or they're doing it only because there's some kind of reward. Right? They're doing it for external motivation. That's the only reason why they're doing something. And that may be good for today or for this shift or whatever, but what we want is them to get over this hill and onto this other side where it's not about external motivation, it's about them being internally inspired. They understand why I should be doing this. They understand the consequences. They understand the true burden of disease. They understand the impact of their actions. That internal inspiration is what gets them to maybe do that all the time. And maybe even communicate with other employees. Hey, you should be doing this way because of this. And they kind of extend that messaging. And they extend that period of time where, again, now they're really gravitating towards embracing good operating procedures, good food safety practices, good understanding. And you truly now have a culture of food safety. A culture of food safety is not people doing things once or twice because of fear of not doing it and getting caught. A culture of food safety is people doing it because they understand if they don't do this, this will happen. And quite honestly, this could happen to themselves. This could happen to their family. This could happen to their neighbors. This could happen to their children. That there's no immunity because you simply work in the food industry. So understanding how we communicate things such that we go beyond external motivation and focus on internal inspiration. In doing this, though, we have to find ways of acknowledging that to do this requires a great deal of courage. Now, I've talked about some encounters with folks. I want to talk about one more encounter. Years ago, I met with a family of a young boy who had E. coli. He was on dialysis and he had a stroke. He's 4 years old on dialysis. He has a stroke. He loses the use of his right arm. He survives. About 4 or 5 years later, I have another opportunity to be in their city, and the mom says, hey, why don't we meet up for coffee really quick? I don't even drink coffee, but I get the idea. So we're talking. She brings me up to speed with how he's doing, and at some point she shows me, she kind of takes out of her purse this crayon drawing that her son drew. And she says, look, one of the things that I hear from him often is he can't play in the playground like the other kids. He wishes he could. He wishes that someone had said something or had done something to have prevented him from essentially living with a mark of this forever mark of this failure in food safety. And that if that person had said or done something that to him, that person would be a hero. And what he drew was a superhero in flight, like cape and tights flying. It wasn't someone in a suit or a lab coat or a beard net, hair net. It wasn't someone with a name tag. It wasn't someone with a briefcase. In this world of DC and Marvel superheroes, literally describe the work that people in this room do as being at the same level as being worthy of wearing that cape. This was a big eye-opener for me. The idea that it's often hard to paint a picture or to describe our work, but to a kid who's going to live like this forever looks at the work that we do and says, this is so heroic, you should be wearing a cape. And I had an opportunity to reflect on Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. How many people have heard of it? How many people read it? I understand. I've read it. When I was a middle school teacher, I had my students read it. But what most people don't realize is that the London Daily Times in 1906 had a literary review of the book and said that before we get into a discussion of the literature in the book, we need to talk about the real-world impact of this book. It's unfortunate, but it's all true that the president's own men have validated everything that's described by Mr. Sinclair in this book. And there's a great, actually, the National Archives has letters between Teddy Roosevelt and Upton Sinclair where they were trying to get to the heart of what was going on in Chicago. Interesting research there to find those artifacts. But what sticks with me from this review is that this one sentence, the things described by Mr. Sinclair happened yesterday are happening today and tomorrow until some Hercules comes to cleanse the filthy stable. That was from 1906. And today, I think these words ring very true. And obviously, we're not waiting for a Hercules or any one person to do this. But the idea that perhaps food safety requires a Herculean effort, an enormous amount of work and strength, and a lot of our technologies help us with that work and strength, but it goes back to courage, an enormous amount of courage in order to pull this off. Courage to work within the lack of resources or the lack of compensation or the lack of people doing what you do, the lack of this continuously ongoing series of challenges, a seemingly endless cycle of failures that are out there that take on new dimensions every single time you turn around. It takes a lot of courage. And I don't think that not only are you compensated for that courage, I don't think a lot of people recognize the courage that it takes to do the job that everyone in this room does. I don't think that HR hires for courage. I don't think that's a bullet point on a job listing. I don't think that companies put a lot of or enough effort into evolving and developing and supporting and validating this courage. But it is this courage that I see and I've seen over and over again and that we need to have out there. I think it's a lot of courage. What do we got for time?
It's 9:36.
9:36?
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. I think courage is something that's highly underassociated with the work out there in terms of food safety. And if you are working with a team, maybe you're the most senior person on a team or in your department, or maybe you're the most junior person, I want you to look at the people you work with and think about the idea of how do we validate the courage that's taken, the courage that's needed with those different people there. What I'd like to do, I know people wait to the end and ask if there's questions, but I'd like to ask questions in the middle, and so I still have some time to come back with some content here. And I know that we have a microphone. Does this microphone work? You can hear me, right? It doesn't sound like this in my ears. What are some questions that anyone might have about food safety? I see a hand all the way in the back here. All the way in the back here.
Okay. So if you want to ask a question, raise up your hands so that I can see you. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah. And thank you, Darren. It's always powerful to listen to you talk. Michelle Samaritan, I'm with the National Environmental Health Association. Darren keynoted for us earlier last year. So when you talk about social media, you talk about where the average person gets their food safety information, we know it's not from us. We try. Would like some perspective on that, and also that we we've got an outbreak and we're trying to find out what's going on, we shouldn't be finding out that there's an outbreak in our backyard from the bark club.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on how we can amplify our voices, better the communication both between us as the regulators and the general public, and for us as regulators to other regulators? Thank you, sir.
Great question. And let me start off by a few observations. One is that in 1993, there was so much coverage of the E. coli outbreak with Jack in the Box. By the way, if you don't know, Jack in the Box is like a Burger King. Okay? That, again, my son being airlifted to the hospital was covered in the news. There was stuff on the news every single night. My son's funeral was covered live on television. And I found out years later that the Jack in the Box actually threatened the health department to sue them because up until a certain point, they were just Restaurant X. If they revealed to the public that Jack in the Box was a source of this, even though it was known by the investigators and the company that they were going to sue the health department for libel, because the health department had no role in saying to the public where the source of this problem was. And as crazy as that sounds, we heard the same exact argument during Chipotle. The CEO of Chipotle saying the CDC has no business telling the public that our company is at the heart of this. Crazy. Number two, found out years later that there was pressure with the ABC, NBC, CBS news affiliates in Seattle to stop covering all this E. coli outbreak stuff because not Jack in the Box, but some other major hamburger restaurant, they were the sponsors of the 11 o'clock news, and they were going to pull their sponsorship because they were losing business. Then you look at the fact that I combined my research with research that was done at The Ohio State University that looked at all of the newspaper headlines from 1993 about this outbreak, from the Washington Post, the New York Times, and Los Angeles Times, and compared it to the headlines from those local papers, the Seattle Times, Seattle Post-Intelligencer, the local newspapers. And there's a fundamental difference, and I'm going to show this difference in my afternoon workshop on a slide so you can see this. But there's a vast difference in what the American consumer would get from information from a national newspaper coverage versus a local newspaper coverage about the same exact event. So beyond observations, what would I recommend? I recommend that not only at a national level, at a state level, but also even at a county by county level, that if you've not already done so, you develop a really good relationship with your various media outlets. To the point where I would even recommend that perhaps the New Jersey Environmental Education Association consider that in their 2025 event, that they have a session about media and press coverage, and they invite journalists. They invite people from universities that have schools for journalisms. They invite those students. They even invite social media influencers from the state to come to learn about how to communicate public health information that could make or break the safety of individuals, families, and people in their own communities. If you have this kind of proactive relationship and talk about things, have a panel with various reporters, television, newspaper, social media, whatever it is, talking about some of the barriers, some of the obstacles, some of the successes and how they've overcome some of these challenges. I think they would provide a great opportunity to not only inform them, and hopefully they continue on with that message, but it might also enlighten those individuals at the tables right now in terms of, oh, I didn't realize that, or oh, that would be a better way of me doing this kind of a thing. If we were to build a better relationship for this, I think that everyone in here would find some ease in communicating with these individuals, and I think that our communities would perhaps find some victories as well.
Next question. Good morning. Hi, I'm Paul Bellenboyer. I'm a health officer for Jersey City, and I particularly liked your point about the courage of frontline personnel. we're consciously trying to teach that in our department. We love our health inspectors, but sometimes, there are all kinds of pressures to let things go. So we try to affirm them, especially when they close a place, and knowing that there are going to be the phone calls and outside pressures to get them back in business quickly. But we also try to give them training to be appropriately assertive, claim their authority. I wonder if you have any thoughts or examples of courageous frontline personnel and how they got there, and how they practice it, and how they teach it to others.
Great question. Thank you very much. I encountered a scenario a few years back, which I think could be used as a model for any level company. Usually, it is someone with a job title and description about food safety that focuses on food safety. And yet I talk to people that say, you know what, some of my biggest obstacles come from these people I work with here. I'm supposed to be working with them. I had a VP of food safety quality assurance have me help her because they needed to replace their facility floors. It was well beyond the lifespan of the floors. They were so chipped and cracked that they couldn't properly clean and take samples. And yet it was the director of financing that said, no, we can't spend this money on this. And how do we convince this person that they need to do this, right? So here you have the VP of food safety quality assurance for a company, and yet the director of financing was the obstacle in this case. And I was brought on board to try to help communicate some courage and information about this, because in this case, it was actually a discussion about the cost of doing nothing that they weren't having that was the missing piece. You could say it cost $2 million to replace that floor, but let's look at the cost of noncompliance. Let's look at the cost of doing nothing. Whether it is out-of-court settlements or federal fines or people's lives, that there is no do-over. There's no recovery for many of these, right? So we have to look at that. Now, beyond that, often, again, it's the people with food safety in their job title or job description that are dealing with certain things. I'm seeing more and more companies that are doing what they typically call employee-led food safety committees or something along that lines, where they'll have someone from security, from warehouse, from shipping, from maintenance, from engineering, from all these different divisions, from people they don't even contact the food at all, right? They're way over here in this division or whatever, but they have someone from every different facet of the business come together once a quarter to talk about food safety. And yeah, one could say, all right, it's a logistics nightmare and it's going to cost some money and take time. How do we do all this kind of stuff? But one year, I think it was 3 years ago, I heard the most incredible output of this. There was an environmental health inspector at a facility noticing that there was these gaps and gashes about, 6, 7, 8 inches off the ground in a frozen frozen food storage unit. Trying to figure out what was going on. They called someone from plant services out there, and basically were describing that when it gets too cold in there, that the forklift would slip on the floor, and that's actually from the blade. So the CEO goes, I want non-slip wheels on here. I spare no expenses. Get the best out there. And so the director of engineering and maintenance got on this and came back, and they were a part of this food safety, employee-led food safety committee. So it comes back and says, well, this is the best product out there, but we shouldn't buy this. Why shouldn't we buy this? Anyone know what makes the best non-slip wheels for forklifts non-slip? Here's a shocker. Walnut shells embedded within the rubber. What's the problem with walnut shells in the rubber of the wheels of forklift in a food production facility? Allergen. They were certified nut allergen free, And if they had gone with the best in the market product, they would have invalidated their certification to remain a nut allergen-free food production facility. And that would not have happened if they had not included different people into that employee-led food safety committee. So it's not about making sure that the people that are specialists have all the training and knowledge and understanding. It's even about the people on the peripheral, because they come into contact, they come into exposure, they come into perspectives that allows them to see certain things differently. And when we bring all these people together and talk about it, this goes beyond the do it because I told you to. This starts getting into this area of empowered employees, because they understand this information, because they have a stake in this, because they want to own this. No one wants to go to a job where they're like, hey, I'm here, I hate this place. Notice I said wants to. There's a difference between no one wants to do that and people who actually do that, but they would prefer that they don't have that kind of a thought. But I think that that's what we need to do, is to make sure that not only we support the courage, not only we look at those different elements, not only do we think about who we're talking about food safety with and who we're even bringing to events like this, quite honestly, but if you look at it in terms of the idea of how do we empower those people that even are very peripheral to the food safety, quality assurance world, that can make a big difference. Now, okay, how does this apply to restaurants? Your sanitation, your maintenance, all those different people that they're not necessarily in the kitchen cooking, but they need to understand a little bit more about food safety in order to make the company's mission actually come to fruition. Great question.
Thank you. Do we have some hands up for questions? Okay, sure. I'm coming to you.
Hi, my name is David. I'm with the New Jersey State Department of Health, and I'd like to make a comment. Maybe perhaps all of you together and work on this over the years, but I've noticed that in the state of New Jersey, our expectations of retailers are higher than our expectation of wholesalers. I don't know if anybody here has had the experience to go to a wholesale retail facility and you see conditions that quite not be up to standards. And I have no answer for this, because the state does not have, I don't think, the adequate number of inspectors to inspect wholesalers. And many towns in New Jersey do not inspect wholesale facilities. Some do, and some don't. And I don't know what the answer to this is. Perhaps I'm just throwing it out there for all of you for the future, because I'm getting older. But anyway, that's all I have to say.
Thanks for your comment, David.
To respond to this, you raised a very good point. I recently looked at, and Bob Custard in the back and I were both recently looking at some data that looks at the fact that you have, let's say, a county, a large county, they have resources. How are they dividing their resources into the highest level of concern, the highest risk, or the lowest risk type businesses? How many times are they doing a second or a third revisit? How often are they doing these revisits? And there is this kind of assumption that you would spend more resource and personnel time with your higher risk than with your lower risk. And then you start looking at how many businesses don't get inspected. And of course, most people think that all businesses get inspected. But as you're talking about New Jersey, here's what I see. It's like a Russian roulette if you were to do a drive across country. Literally, like 40 states they use the Department of Public Health. 40 states use the Department of Agriculture, and 10 other states have some other different combination of who does this. Some states have different versions of the FDA Model Food Code than others. Some versions are almost 30 years old in certain states. Some are only 3 years old. You have some states that they fund their restaurant inspections, their food facility inspections differently than others. You have some states that have food labs that are CDC approved. There are states out there that if the CDC comes, they will take your data and they'll throw it out and they will start fresh because their food lab in that state is not certified at a high enough level for the CDC to be able to use it. So you don't really necessarily go thinking that my state's is worse than that state or whatever. And I'm not trying to make any kind of a judgment or statement about New Jersey, but if you really, a few months ago, I spoke before the National Conference of State Legislators, and my chief argument was that we are not a nation. We're not one nation in terms of food safety. We are literally 3,000 different jurisdictions. And people are like 3,000, but we only have 50 states. Yeah, but you start breaking that down into counties and tribal reservations and military bases and college and university campuses and all these different things where there's all these different levels. It really gets to be completely different. And how do you parse all this information? How do you have consistency? Imagine being a nationwide retailer, and everywhere you go, every zip code you go into, it's a completely different game book. That's what a lot of our major retailers have to deal with. So thank you for bringing that up, and I think that that's something that we need to maybe look at the idea of at the national level. I think that this is a perfectly logical conversation to be had at the national level. And quite honestly, I'm not going to put all the responsibility onto NEHA on the national level. I should point out that I'm actually currently the chair of NEHA's Food Safety Committee program, and we're looking at the gaps from state to state. And I work with an incredible group of people who volunteer to put in some guidance and recommendations when it comes to restaurant and retail for where sometimes gaps in policy and recommendations exist. And so I'm very honored to be doing that work. It looks like we have a question over here.
Hi, my name is George Barnes. I'm with the Westfield Health Department and also with NJEHA. It's more of a comment than a question, but it's like one of the challenges we find when, as a health inspector and dealing with a lot of these privately owned restaurants is getting the employees invested in caring about food safety and not just accomplishing the acts. What are your thoughts on like things that people could do to try to get the employees to care more about doing things correctly instead of, all right, I gotta make the sauce, no matter how to make it, just gotta get it done.
So, great point / question. Thank you. How many people are sports fans? Doesn't matter what the game is, right? Now, there's winning the game. There's playing the game. There's also sportsmanship. You can lose the game, but demonstrate great sportsmanship. Conversely, you can win the game, but demonstrate poor sportsmanship. When I was a high school, middle school teacher, I talked about smartology. I made it up. Smartology is the difference between getting an A and plagiarizing or getting a B and doing your own original work. Really going above and beyond, trying hard, being original, right? Asking questions. Being part of the discourse, the dialogue in the classroom. This was part of what, sportsmanship, this is what a smartologist does. A smartologist does these kind of things. I think New Jersey should welcome my $10 million suggestion. I'm going to give you a gift of $10 million for this idea. New Jersey should create a program called Safeology. Doesn't matter what your job title is, doesn't matter where you work, doesn't matter how much you're paid, doesn't matter where you sit on the totem pole or pyramid, but you could demonstrate Safeology in terms of the fact that you understand this, you've taken this course, you've got the certification, and you demonstrate, like, for instance, not using the glass to scoop ice, or not putting your thumb after you just wipe down the table into someone's plate, or all these different things that you see, we hear, we read about, right? If there was a way of like cot carrying or a Safeology kind of a thing, a program where it could be technically beyond the company you work for, like it doesn't matter if you work for this company or that company, you can still be a Safeologist, right? The idea of the state level awarding of individuals who are taking these steps and really they invest into the awareness and their actions demonstrate that in terms of food safety. And this is promoted kind of a thing. I think that would be a great way of inspiring and validating the courage that's not dependent on that small mom and pop owned restaurant to do, but the idea we can recognize this at a larger level, that people do this kind of a thing. How we execute that, well, that's not part of what I'm offering you, but I don't know how to do that. But my thinking is that I see this in many different contexts. There are places that say we need this, but it doesn't work individually if it's not part of a bigger plan, or if there's not a bigger amount of eyes or resources on this that can support this. And I don't want to say that getting a Safeologist award from a mom and pop restaurant doesn't mean anything, but working for a small mom and pop restaurant and getting a Safeologist award from the state of New Jersey, well, to me, that would hold a little bit more weight. And if we recognize things like this, perhaps there's a way about going that maybe that person is, highlighted in communication or whatever it is that you think of as a good way of doing that. But I think that, again, we can't necessarily assume that all these individual players are going to inspire and support the courage to be able to be safe. I think that we have to look at this as part of a bigger network. Great. I lost where our microphone is. We have a hand up. Here, there we go.
So, Upton Sinclair has a quote that said, I ate at a public stomach part, but I did it in the stomach, referencing that jungle was really for like terrible working conditions in there. And that was in 1906. So going forward, how do you think that public health should consider working conditions, stuff like COVID?
Far too often we look at the voices of victims and of families who've lost children. We got to realize that they're humans too. That they're going through a grieving process, they're going through a learning process, they are figuring out how to live in this new world, right? Now, personally, I bring my son's photo with me. He is frozen in my mind as being 16 months old from 1993. And most people who see him on web pages or in articles or in documentaries, they see him as being this age as well. When I was a high school, middle school teacher, I got to this point where I realized that my students were the same age now that my son would have been if he had not died. And it was a bit of a wake-up call for me in terms of the idea of what I missed in those years. And I live with this. And I'm not saying that people need to carry around a picture of my son. What I am saying is perhaps we need to get away from the statistics, the numbers, the pie charts, the bar graphs of saying, well, here's, in terms of likelihood and severity, look at these numbers. Perhaps a better way of talking about likelihood and severity is to say, look at these faces. Listen to these stories. Now, don't show someone's picture without their permission. But you'd be amazed how many parents send me the photo of their child and say, please, will you tell my son's story? Will you talk about my daughter? Will you explain that, in the case of 8-year-old Joshua from Braintree, Massachusetts, which is about, 20 minutes south of Boston. He at 8 years of age got sick from E. coli and dies. And investigators were literally able to trace the E. coli in him to a lot of ground beef that was sent to Whole Foods, that one, in Braintree, Massachusetts, and find that the USDA had already sent that grocery store a letter saying that we're going to ask you to recall and take this product off your shelf because it tested positive for E. coli. And the manager said, well, no one's complaining about this. I don't have anything to support this. I think we'll just go ahead and continue to sell it. And they did continue to sell it for several weeks until lawyers literally came to the door to say, hey, you continue to sell it even though the USDA asked you to take it off because it proved to be contaminated, and now this young boy's dead. Perhaps numbers and statistics weren't enough to convince that manager that this is real and that the likelihood and severity is much more significant. The idea that there is a 4-year-old girl named Serena Prophet in Portland, Oregon, who has bloody diarrhea, and her father takes her to an urgent care clinic. On the way, he calls his brother and it describes the symptoms, and the brother goes, I'm sure he was Googling, WebMD or something like that, you should ask them to test for E. coli. They got seen by the doctor, and on the side of the medical intake forms, it even said E. coli ? But the doctor thought that, hey, I don't think I need to test for E. coli. I think my best plan of action is to tell them to keep their daughter hydrated, and you might want to follow up with your family doctor within a week and send a 4-year-old girl with bloody diarrhea home. Spoiler alert, that girl never got a chance to go to the family doctor because she was dead within 2 days because of renal failure. Perhaps numbers and statistics weren't enough to convince a doctor that they need to do some testing to follow up on this with someone who's in the most vulnerable population area. I could go on and tell multiple stories about this, but putting a name and a story behind this, I think, is what we have to do as the people who have these opportunities to interact with people and say, there's a problem here, and this is how you should fix it, but also this is why you should fix it. I think that this would go a long way in terms of trying to really bring about change that, from 31 years of my experience, numbers and statistics alone do not do. I think that is how you aim for the heart in order to impact much more than just the stomach. Over here.
Hi everyone, my name is Elizabeth. And before I became a health inspector, I was running a restaurant for 15 years. And one day I decided to change my career and I became a health inspector. So I was on the other side for 15 years. And during my 7-year career as a health inspector, I had a pleasure to work with multiple municipalities. And the big issue that I observe is the lack of providing the proper education for employees, for person in charge. And I think this is a big issue. And online classes, I think this is the killing, it's really hurting, not hurting, it's improper education. It's improper, maybe not improper education. People don't understand what they learn during those online classes. They take those classes, then we come and we realize even everybody is certified, they don't know anything. And I think that's a big issue. And just recently I decided to add something to my career, and I start to providing training and consulting. And I think that's where we need to start with, providing proper education, because if they don't understand why they need to fix the violations that we are at our inspection issuing violations, and we're not explaining why those violations need to be corrected and what they're doing wrong, they're never going to change. So we need, I think the online classes, that's a big issue, and then providing the proper education.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on all that you're doing there. Let's give, yeah, sure. I can look at my career and I can put it in different phases, and I think that some of you can see some of this. Initially, I found that there was misinformation and lacking information, and I wanted to put information out there. And I wanted my son's story to be told. Then I moved into academia. I have various degrees. I taught in public schools for 16 years. I've taught at university for 14 years. I currently teach at 2 universities. And yeah, actually most of my classes I teach are online. I will admit that. But speaking in front of audiences, as you'll probably know, you can count my number of slides on one finger. Because going beyond teaching, we need to be able to inspire. We need to be able to get real. We need to be able to motivate those around us. And one of the things that I've kind of rephrased my work in recently, not just my work, but I think the work that all of us do, is in 4 phases. And if you were to write down anything as a takeaway from this, if you have any room left from all the great things you've written down already, I would ask that you write down the word courage, We need to make sure we have that. But these next 4 things, I think, are incredibly important for you to think about not only where you sit within this, but those around you. I think of this as the 4 A's. The letter A 4 times. The first A is awareness. We have to have awareness of certain things. Awareness of the culture around environmental health agencies. Awareness about the challenges at the retail or the restaurant level. Awareness of community public health issues. Awareness of the challenges. Even awareness of the media and how they communicate or not. Awareness of those who are somewhat disconnected from food safety but could play a big role. So awareness is that kind of bottom tier. From people who are aware, we can now build allies. That idea of people who are supporting us, people who are supporting our mission, people who support the work that we do, whether it is as simple as how we clean things, how we cook things, how we don't cross-contaminate, or how we invest in a culture around food safety. We need to have those allies. People need to support us, and we need to support people. Even if we don't do that job, we need to support them in doing that job safely. The third level is advocacy. The idea of being able to be out there and communicate and support, push new initiatives, try new ideas, bring new perspectives to an event, invite media people to an event to learn on a panel, whatever it is. Being an advocate is someone who is looking out for other people as well. Other agencies, other stakeholders, other partners in food safety. And then the top level, and I don't mean this to be that this is the end, but that top level is activism. There are times in our career where we need to go beyond being an advocate and literally be that voice. The loudest voice in the room, the loudest voice in front of legislators, policymakers, executives, media, whatever it is, to talk about an issue. If you are talking about food safety with a reporter, you are more than aware, hopefully. You're more than an ally. You're more than an advocate. At that point, you are being an activist in terms of what you are conveying to someone in the media about food safety. We need to do this. We need to stop this. You need to know this, whatever it is. That is the role of being an activist. Now, here's a beautiful thing. It's kind of like the leader of that flock of birds flying south in the V formation. What does the lead bird do all the time? Tell me I'm not the only one who knows this. I heard it. They swap out to allow someone else to take over the lead because they can't keep up in that first position because all the drag, all the wind resistance is on them. They will allow other people to take the lead. That's how I think of this. You can't always be the activist in your career. You can't always act as the advocate for everything. Sometimes I can agree with an issue, but there's nothing I can do about it, but I can be aware about it. And I can be an ally to those people who are doing something about it. And I can support them in being that advocate. And I can recognize that that person is being an activist on this issue. And I think that sometimes I have felt overwhelmed by all the different issues out there, and I can't do everything about it. But I can see that I'm fluctuating in the spectrum from awareness to activist in what I do, and I can see an issue and I can see what I can do when wearing that hat. And I would hope that what I'm explaining to you might be an eye-opener in terms of, if you haven't thought about this, that you don't always have to be the advocate. You don't always have to be the activist. Sometimes being aware and being an ally to others who are within this realm, if you will, is enough. And that is healthy. That is sustainable. It's also very powerful when you look at the bigger group of everyone realizing where they sit between awareness, ally, advocate, and activist. So thank you for seeing that you were here and you want to be here, but knowing that sometimes you have to stop being over here and you have to just go back to being here, and that it all works together. Looks like we have time for maybe one more question. Or two. social media,
Yes.
public health.
So, what happens if we know this social media is available to community residents, available to them? And local health department, how would they navigate and give misinformation and panic associated with social media when it comes to outbreak?
Thank you very much. You know, I worry about misinformation, but to some extent, I think kind of like I talked about ally aware or aware ally activist kind of advocacy. Sometimes you need to look at misinformation as a gift. A, there may be misinformation out there, but at least they're talking about this. B, they open the door. They open the door for you to go and say, thank you for talking about this. Let's add some additional information onto this. And maybe now you can build onto a momentum, even if it started with misinformation, to, okay, let's correct that. We have the resources, we have the people who can go on social media or go out there and say, hey, let's talk about this in light of this piece of misinformation. Let's add some more pieces of information to it so that we have a better understanding of this issue. So don't always think of misinformation as the worst thing that could happen. If you respond to it by using it as an opportunity to correct it, put more information out there, engage in a dialogue, but I wouldn't shoot the messenger. All right, I wouldn't basically say how horrible of a person are you for putting out misinformation. I don't think that most misinformation is necessarily intentional. I would say, thank you for talking about this, but I'd like to add some more information to this so that we can have a better conversation around it. And I think that misinformation, whether it's social media or any media platform, is something that needs to be part of that panel or discussion involving journalism and media talking about public health. It'd be a misstep to not include misinformation with that.
Okay, finally, we have a question that somebody sent.
Oh, I didn't even know that was a thing. Awesome.
Sure.
Someone texted a question.
Yeah, somebody sent in a question. With all the current food safety work we do, what else do you think must be done to educate the general public and raise awareness about the importance of food safety?
I think that this is going to get a little personal here, but I have other sons as well. And on one end of the spectrum, I didn't want to raise them in a plastic bubble. I can't shield them from everything. But on the other hand, we live in a world with invisible dangers, invisible threats. How many people have said to your children, look both ways before you cross the street? How many people have said, wear your seatbelt before we get moving in the car? Maybe even be careful online. Don't give out too much information. Don't reveal too much information about yourself, right? We are aware of, and we communicate this idea of invisible dangers, invisible threats out there all the time. Why don't we talk about this as a society in terms of food more often? I mean, I know we need food to eat, but we can't treat food as if we don't have a responsibility. Not that we have the only responsibility, but we do play a role in terms of responsibility at home. I think that if we build our own consumer culture around food safety that talks about food in terms of the idea that food is awesome, food can be great if we treat it properly, if we don't cross-contaminate. I've asked this before in many different audiences. Of course, I'm going to ask it here, and you're all going to probably say the right answer, but when I asked my 7th and 8th graders who were starting at home to help out with things like unloading the dishwasher, I always ask them, what's the first thing you do when you unload the dishwasher? I heard it. Wash your hands. You know how many people this was a surprise for? What? Yeah, everybody. Why is not washing your hands before you unload the dishwasher a concept that should be kind of obvious, right? Now, that's not necessarily saying, oh, be afraid of chicken, right? I'm not saying that. But the idea of washing your hands before you unload the dishwasher should not be some novel concept that's some new age kind of thing that Darren Detwiler spews to audiences. And I strategically tell my students this before parent night or back to school night or whatever. And then I ask the parents, hey, what do you tell your kids to do before they unload the dishwasher? And all the students are like, wash your hands. So boom, success. I got my students to tell their parents that maybe washing their hands is important, not just for the kids, but for the parents too. The point being, I'm glad that whoever asked this online is asking this. I wish that we don't rely on industry to have a food safety culture. I wish that we could encourage and support and enable courage is good, but a culture around food safety for every consumer, in every home, at every table, not just the ones where they're living with a chair forever empty because of a failure, and that's how they know about food safety. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for your courage in what you do, for your courage in being here, and for your courage in sticking with me for 2 hours at the beginning of a Monday and listening to me talk about my perspectives, not only on navigating your future legacy, but also in terms of the ripple effect that you have in our communities, across your state, and in this country. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. And before you leave for your next class, please can you drop off